In this series, we've been talking about the 4 most detrimental patterns of communication that spell the end of a relationship. Today, we're going to be talking about defensiveness and how that probably left you feeling very alone and unsatisfied in your relationship. I'm going to give you some very clear steps on how to recognize defensiveness and what to do about it as you continue to move forward in your life. At its core, defensiveness is no more than denying responsibility. It's when somebody is trying to share a message with you, you refuse to make any room for it and deny any possible part that you might have had in the situation. The ability to resolve conflict effectively is one of the most important aspects of having a healthy relationship. And defensiveness is one of the things that predictably gets in the way of that. Because in order to be able to resolve conflict, there has to be room for both people to have their voices heard, to have their feelings and their thoughts heard. And when somebody gets defensive, whether it's you or your partner, it immediately shuts down any ability to be able to process through what's going on. You probably have experienced this a lot in your relationships, and as your marriage began to end and was moving toward that end, it's likely that there was a lot of defensiveness. So I want to get into exactly what that looks like and how you can know if somebody is being defensive or if you're being defensive. And in order to understand this, it's really important to understand the concept of the window of tolerance, which you may be familiar with. But every single one of us has a window of tolerance. And as long as we're in that window, we are able to stay in our upper brains. Our frontal lobes are the part of the brain that we're communicating with. And sometimes the window of tolerance is big, and sometimes it's really narrow. But when something happens and we start to get out of our windows of tolerance, our amygdala is the part of our brain that begins to take control of the conversation and begins to be the part of our brain that is now communicating. And the amygdala's job is to handle threat. The amygdala is constantly on the lookout, looking for any signs of danger. Am I feeling anything weird in my stomach? Is there any tightness in my chest? Do I have a lump in my throat? Is there any sign in the environment? The amygdala's job is to keep us safe, and so it's constantly on the lookout for possible threat. And as soon as there's anything that the amygdala perceives as threat, it tries to take control, and it literally shuts off the frontal lobes and tries to take control of the conversation. And the problem with that is that the amygdala only has 3 tools. The amygdala either can fight, can flee, or can freeze. And sometimes people talk about fawning as well. But those are the only tools in the toolbox that the amygdala has. So it's a hammer, a crescent wrench, and a screwdriver. Now, if the job requires one of those things, or in other words, if you're actually in danger, if you're being chased by a bear, if your hand is on a hot surface, then you want your amygdala to be the part of your brain that's coping. But today, in most of our lives, the way most of us live, there are very few times when we're actually in danger, and we actually need the amygdala to be the part of the brain that is coping. But once we get out of our window of tolerance, which frequently happens with conflict, then the amygdala takes over, literally actually shuts off the upper brain. You can see this. Blood is taken away from the frontal lobes, and the amygdala then takes over and gets ready to deal with the perceived threat. Well, that certainly leads to defensiveness and denying responsibility. That's a very common fight response, is no, this isn't my problem, this is your problem, and immediately breaks down communication. In order to be able to understand what defensiveness looks like, it's really important to revisit or understand what communication is. And hopefully you've watched our previous video on communication and you have a little bit of framework of that. But what communication is the process of getting a message from one person to the next. And that requires both people. It requires the person sending the message, the quarterback, to throw a good pass, and it requires the receiver to catch the pass. And as we talked about in previous videos, there are 3 parts to any communication. There's the behavior that we're talking about, and there's the way that the person feels about that behavior, and then there's also why they feel that way. And so defensiveness comes in when the listener is unwilling to receive the message that the quarterback is trying to deliver. It's like the quarterback's throwing a pass And the receiver's like, nope, I'm not going to catch it. And so in order to be able to understand defensiveness and the healthy alternatives to defensiveness, you've got to first keep in mind what role you're in. And when you're the listener, which is the role that applies to defensiveness, your job is to help the other person feel understood. There are three different levels of listening. The first level, which is where most of us live, is listening to respond. And so as soon as you start sharing something to me, especially if it feels like a criticism or some kind of attack, my brain is immediately thinking about how to respond to you. So you start talking to me about me coming home late, and I'm immediately going into all the reasons why I come home late and how it's not even fair for you to be upset about me coming home late, because half the time when I do come home, you're consumed with other things. You're not spending any time with me anyway. And so that's that first level of listening is listening to respond. And it doesn't matter what it is. If you're talking to me about me, leaving my shoes in the living room, or I'm trying to talk to you about how I feel about the way that you're parenting, or the way that we're parenting, or the way we're spending money, or whatever. The lowest level of listening is just listening to respond. And so that's very far away from listening to help the other person feel understood. The second level of listening is listening to understand, which sounds really good, right? Because we all think, oh yeah, well, let's listen to understand. Well, the problem with that is that as soon as I think that I understand what you're saying, I stop listening and I go into my response for it. And so, and that typically happens far sooner than you actually feel understood. And so if my goal is to listen and understand, and I stop listening or start responding when I think I understand, that's almost always going to be much earlier than you actually feeling understood by me. And so the goal, the Shangri-La, the top of the mountain of listening is listening to help the other person feel understood. And this ties right back into the importance of this primary attachment relationship and the needs that we have here. Now, in this primary attachment relationship, you'll remember from previous videos as well that we all have two primary needs. And the first one of those needs is to feel like we matter. Do I matter to those to whom I'm supposed to matter? This is supposed to be the place where I get to matter, which means that I have a healthy expectation that you're going to actually care what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling. And this is also supposed to be the place where I get to be the safest. My feelings, my thoughts, my desires are supposed to be safest with you, more safe with you than anybody else, and vice versa. And so that listening to help the other person feel understood helps meet those two needs that we have. Because when we feel understood, when we actually feel understood, it is like the deepest breath of psychological air. And when we're trying to communicate and we don't feel understood, it's literally like suffocating. And we're fighting for air. And when you've got two people that are fighting for air, you've got both people talking at each other, both people being defensive, and both people desperately trying to get a deep breath, and nobody has the oxygen mask. And what listening effectively does is to provide the oxygen mask. And when somebody listens well to you, it is like a shot of straight oxygen to the brain. It provides that psychological air. And so that highest level of listening is listening to help the other person feel understood. And you do that through 4 steps. And these are the most important things that I want you to remember. It is your job. What's your job? It's your job to help the other person feel understood. How do you do that? You do that through these 4 steps. The first thing is to listen for the BFW. You listen for the behavior that they're talking about. You listen for how they feel about that behavior. And you listen for why they're feeling that way. And you ask questions until you understand each of those things. And how do you know that you understand? You reflect those things back. So it sounds to me like when I come home late, it makes you feel lonely and maybe even a little betrayed, because you're interpreting that as all these other things that I'm doing instead of coming home are more important to me than coming home and being with you. Did you hear the BFW? So the behavior is me coming home late. The feeling is lonely and maybe betrayed. And then the W is because you're interpreting that as these other things being more important to me than being with you. So those are the first 3 steps. And then the fourth one is one that most people don't talk about, and one of the gems that you're going to get here in our program. And it's actually a really simple step, but super important. And that is communicating that how the other person feels matters to you. And you do that simply by saying it. Well, man, the last thing I want is for you to feel like you don't matter to me. The last thing I want you to feel is lonely, and even worse, to feel betrayed by me. And those other things are not more important to me than you. But I don't even need to go into that. What I need to communicate is that I care about how you feel. And that fourth step protects attachment. It protects the connection, the mattering, and the safety between us, and is really, really important. Okay, and the reason why most of us get defensive is because we confuse understanding with agreement. And I can totally understand where you're coming from and disagree with that, or have a very different perspective. One of the analogies that I think about a lot is that of an elephant, right? If we're talking about an elephant, and you're standing at the front of the elephant, and I'm standing at the back of the elephant, and we're both very close to the elephant, your perspective is going to be a big trunk and maybe some tusks, some big ears, right? And my perspective at the other end of the elephant might just be gray, right? It might be a little tail, but it's just going to be this big gray mass. And so when we're trying to communicate with each other, if we don't recognize that we're coming at an issue, almost any issue, we'll be coming at it from 2 different perspectives. If we don't keep that in mind, then I think that I need to agree that you're seeing, I need to agree that tusks and a trunk are the reality of this. And so the more we talk, if we're not communicating effectively, I'm like saying, no, that's not accurate. This is just a big gray wrinkly thing, and it's got this weird little tail. And you're like, no, this big tusk and these big ears. And I'm like, you're crazy. That's not what's going on here. And so the process of communicating is the process of getting messages back and forth between you and I in an effective way. And so if you keep that in mind, my job isn't, when I'm listening, my job isn't to convince you that my perspective is correct, nor is it my job to agree with your perspective. My job is to help you feel understood by understanding how you're seeing the situation and where you're standing in relation to the situation, and the angle that you're coming at it is going to lead to a very different perspective than mine. And neither one of us is wrong, right? An elephant is tusks and trunks and ears and a tail and lots of big gray wrinkly skin. That's all true. And so by taking the time to communicate well, to care about your perspective, and to communicate that I do care about it, dramatically helps us communicate much more effectively. Interestingly, irreconcilable differences are cited in somewhere between 60 to 70% of the reasons for all divorces. So what does that mean? What does irreconcilable differences actually mean? What that means was that the 2 people had an inability to get on the same page about whatever the issue was. And then when that becomes a pattern across time, you have an inability to get on the same page over more and more and more issues, until there are so many things and so much distance between the 2 of you that it becomes very hopeless that we're ever going to be able to get on the same page, work as a team, and be able to move forward. So what that is, if you rephrase that and look at what that actually is an inability to communicate. It's an inability to be able to get messages back and forth in an effective way where we can both respect where the other person is coming from and be able to work through things so that we don't have all of these things building up in between us, creating more and more space. So lack of communication might have been one of the biggest red flags in your relationship that you didn't know what to do about. You didn't know how to resolve. Most of us recognize when communication isn't going well, but a lot of times we don't necessarily know why it's not going well, and even fewer of us know what to do about it. And so that's what I want to help you be able to learn in these videos. One of the biggest keys of being able to communicate well is understanding what your role is at any given point in the communication process. When it's your job to present a message well, and when it's your job to receive a message well, and how to do that in an effective way that helps your partner feel valued by you and helps them feel safe with you. So now I would invite you to watch the next video. The next video is on the #1 predictor of divorce. And I would be shocked if it wasn't a major contributor to why your previous relationship failed.